Hello everyone, and welcome to this 6th RICS World Built Environment Forum European Regional Webinar on building circularity into the European economies through sustainable procurement. My name is Sander Scheurwater, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for this webinar. The RICS World Built Environment Forum is a global network of people interested in getting information and discussing on the greatest challenges and opportunities in the built environment. So if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to go to the link you see at the bottom of this slide, rics.org/WBEF, and sign up and join our WBEF community. So moving on to today's topic. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, public procurement accounts for an average of about 12% of GDP in OECD countries and up to 30% of GDP in developing countries. Sustainable procurement and in relation ESG compliance is becoming increasingly important, not only for public authorities, but also those in the private and non-profit sectors. In doing so, the aims are, of course, to embed sustainability in the value chain and to reduce operational cost and risk. Now, everybody is talking about it, everybody is writing about it, but has it already gone mainstream? The panel today will share their insights with you, covering a range of topics, and will ultimately give their views on whether it indeed has become mainstream. Before they do, a few words from my side to set the scene. I think first, and at its most basic, it is important to understand what the so-called circular economy actually is and how it differs from the worldview we have had basically since the Industrial Revolution, if not before. It is a view that is best described as the linear economy, where economic theories talked about scarcity of capital and labor, but with unlimited availability of natural resources. We know this could not be further from the truth, further from reality, but many economic theories that are being used and related policies and markets are still based on this thinking and measured through this thinking, i.e., for example, GDP growth, which could already indicate that circularity and sustainability may not be as mainstream as some think it is or would like it to be. During the previous European WBF webinar, I already shared Kate Raworth's vision of the donut economy, which is a new economic model taking into account both people through a social foundation or a minimum state that would enable all humans to thrive, and an ecological ceiling, a maximum state our planet can sustain. This could, for example, be one of those new models, or to use it in economic terms, to appropriately internalize external cost. Moving on, governments like the EU and associations like RICS and many other stakeholders see this relevance already, and we all have a role to play. But doing sustainability and accurately measuring progress around circularity and sustainable procurement requires adequate standards and measurement, leading to consistent and transparent reporting and accountability. We all need to be talking about the same thing. RICS, being the 150-year plus professional body that we are, we have a Latin motto that says est modus in rebus, which can be translated as there is measure in all things. I just mentioned that we may still be measuring progress in line with the linear economy rather than the circular one, but change is happening. Also within the EU, who have been working on getting a common understanding and measurement, for example, through the work of the EU taxonomy. So that's the introduction to this topic. I'm now going to move on to introducing the panel, from whom you will hear some incredible insights. And as we will be linking it to our questions on circularity, procurement, and whether it has already gone mainstream, I urge you to keep in mind the fundamental importance of how it is all measured and reported. So we have 4 excellent speakers today. I will now introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So first, I'm happy to introduce Josefina Lindblom from the European Commission, who will give us an overview of the EU activities and progress in this field, so touching upon the Green Deal, the taxonomy, and very specifically the EU levels. So welcome, Josefina. I'm hoping Josefina.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Second, Yvette Watson, co-founder of PHI Factory, an organization specialized at supporting companies with the development and realization of circular concepts in their businesses. And Yvette will share her thoughts on how companies, property owners, and asset managers can embed circularity in their operations. Welcome, Yvette.
Yes, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you. Third, we have Tina Payet, a fellow of the RICS, current chair of the RICS Europe Board, and recently appointed as our next global senior vice president. With her broad interest and expertise, I'm happy to say Tina is quickly becoming a regular on these panels. And today she will be touching upon why we should move more from recycling of materials to reusing. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks, Sandra. It's great to be here.
And finally, Kevin O'Grady, Associate Director at Arup, of course, a much known and respected global advisory and engineering company. Kevin will talk about a project he is involved in around the creation and the importance of material passports. So welcome, Kevin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Privileged to be here.
Thank you all. So before I hand over to Josefina, just a few practicalities for all of you who have joined us, especially for the first time. You will have noticed your microphones are muted, but you can ask questions. Somewhere on your screen, probably on the right-hand side, you will see a question box. Type your question there. If possible, keep it short and indicate in your question to whom you're addressing the question to. And time permitting, of course, I will relay these to the panelists. At the very end of the webinar, a one-question poll will take place on what you thought of it. So please stay on for that. And finally, a summary article, the slides and a recording will be available on our website, rics.org/WBEF, somewhere mid next week. And since you're listening to this, you should all receive an automatic information on that in your inbox when that has happened. So with those formalities out of the way, Josefina, over to you. What do we need to make ESG and impact investment happen in the built environment?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about levels, the new European framework, which is about sustainability of buildings. So why are we actually then working with something like this? Well, if you look at the full life cycle of a building, this sector, the building sector, is responsible for half of all our extracted materials, half of our total energy consumption, a third of our water consumption, and a third of our total generated waste is construction and demolition waste. This is in the EU, I should say. When I say that half of our total energy consumption is linked to the building sector, I of course mean if we look at the full life cycle of buildings. So also then the energy consumption linked to extraction of materials, production of the products, construction itself, etc. So Levels really tries to make life cycle performance understandable to professionals in all kinds of areas, planning and policy making, of course, but also design and execution, as well as financing. So moving on, we then ask ourselves, what is Levels actually then? Well, it is, as I said, an EU assessment and reporting sustainability framework, specifically for buildings. It takes a whole life cycle approach. So it provides a robust way of measuring, so that is assessing the performance, but also how to improve the life cycle performance. It is made up of a set of core indicators which have been developed together with the building sector and also tested by the building sector. We wanted from the beginning to provide some kind of an entry-level tool for the mainstream market. Now, life cycle performance of buildings is part of certain organizations' activities, and there are certification schemes which do this as well. But this typically doesn't reach the actual, can I call it, normal building market or the mainstream market. So we wanted to provide something which would be useful already there and bring in these concepts to the whole market, basically. When we did this, we started off by concluding that we wanted to cover residential buildings and offices, new construction as well as renovation. And as you can see to the right-hand side here, we started already back in 2015, where we set up a number of stakeholder groups to steer us, to guide us, to support us in this work. And then we had a beta version ready 2 years later, which then went through extensive testing by a number of building projects across the EU. And based on their feedback, we were then able to last year have the official launch of Levels. That was in October last year. And right now we are actually busy preparing web-based material to support the user of Levels and to train how to work with Levels. So let's go on. What is Levels then actually? What does it look like? Well, this is it. Even though there are many more documents behind this, this is the condensed version of it. You will see that there are 6 macro objectives. That was actually the first thing that we concluded with our work when we started back in 2015. So these 6 macro objectives are the areas, you could say, in which we have the indicators then to the right-hand side. So greenhouse gas emissions throughout the full building life cycle. That's the first macro objective where we have indicators. The second one, resource efficient and circular material life cycles. That's where all the circularity bit comes in. And then we have water use, health and comfort, adaptation and resilience to climate change. And then we look at life cycle cost and value. So in these areas, for these macro objectives, we have the indicators. So that's Levels. And then if we look at the next slide, we can also see how we can use Levels at 3 different levels. So you can work with the indicators at level 1. Then you are working with the indicators in a qualitative way. That's at concept stage. So then the indicators provide a really good focus for conversations between the design team and the client to agree on what are the main objectives of this project. At level 2, you work with the same indicators, but in a quantitative way. So that's that design and construction. And then it's also, of course, possible to compare different design options to see how they perform. At level 3, you are working with some of the same indicators at least. Well, first of all, probably all of them, because you want to look at the real performance at the handover to the client. But then some of the indicators will also be useful when monitoring the performance during the use phase. So I just want to stress that Levels is a voluntary tool, so you choose which indicators you want to pick up and work with, and also, of course, at what level you want to work with them on. So moving on, what are the key benefits the way we see Levels, and certainly from what we've understood from those who have been very actively part of developing and testing Levels? It is a common language. That was the sort of the objective from the beginning, to provide a common language, which is then based on industry standards. It tracks performance throughout the full life cycle, and it has already started to underpin future EU policies, and we see how it also inspires national policies. So that is really the idea with a common language. In particular, we see how it's taking off now in relation to future-proofing buildings for carbon neutrality. And I'm sorry if you hear a lot of noise, but it is hailing here right now. Levels also enhances the dialogue between stakeholders, and it supports sustainability skills and understanding. This we have already heard many times from those who have tested Levels. As I said before, it targets the mainstream market, and that is quite unique for this kind of a tool. Levels is not a certification scheme. It is this common language. But we have already had certification schemes taking part in developing Levels and testing Levels, and they are now looking at how to align themselves with Levels. So, regardless if you are working in design and execution, planning and policy making, or financing, Levels is indeed for you, because all of these kinds of building professionals took a close part in developing and testing Levels. If we go on to the next one, I want, of course, also to put Levels in the policy context. The EU Green Deal came out or was adopted by the end of 2019 by the then new Commission, which really set out their way of working for the coming 5 years. So that was 2019. It already there stressed the importance of the building sector. And then last year, there were a number of initiatives coming out, the Circular Economy Action Plan, the EU Renovation Wave, and just at the beginning of this year, the new European Bauhaus. And all these sort of sit under the European Green Deal. These three, I mentioned them specifically because they all relate directly to buildings and circularity and life cycle thinking. And of course, levels plays an important part in those initiatives. So what we have tried to do really from the beginning is to bring a minimum number of indicators, which were the ones you saw before, but having them bringing the maximum leverage of sustainability. Yes, if you can still hear me, I ask you to move on to the next slide. Yeah, so what's next for levels? We already heard in the very first brief presentation and the mentioning of the taxonomy and sustainable finance, which is indeed a legislative initiative which is being adopted as we speak now by the Commission. Sustainable finance and the taxonomy there also plays a role for the building sector, and there for new buildings we see levels playing a role as well in bringing in the notion of whole life carbon. Then we have this year 2 revisions of directives linked to the energy performance of buildings. That's the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And in both those, the Commission now is looking at how to bring in the thinking of whole life carbon and circularity, and levels plays an important role in that work. I would say that without levels, we probably wouldn't be able to do it. And then, of course, we have a new European research framework, Horizon Europe, where we are setting up a new, or we are working to set up a public-private partnership, which will be linked to sustainability built environment, where again levels will play, and circularity in general will play an important part. And then we have two initiatives coming up, which we're already working on, but which will be ready in 2023. We are revising our existing green public procurement criteria so that they will be firmly based on levels now. And then a very interesting initiative which comes from the Renovation Wave, which is to develop a roadmap for whole life carbon reduction in this sector, also to be ready then by 2023. And the next one slide will show you what I mentioned earlier on briefly, how we are now working on developing a web-based learning tool and calculator tool. So that should be ready by the end of this year. And then I believe the very last slide of mine just tells you where to go if you're interested in knowing more. So that's the website. And of course, you are very welcome to join our new levels group on LinkedIn as well, which is already very active. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that I could be heard, even though it was absolutely hailstorm here during this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephina, and we could hear you clearly, even if we could also hear the hail. Thank you. I think what you started with, the figures around how much our sector consumes waste, energy, the material that we use, we more or less know it, but it's just so good to keep on repeating that and to show the responsibility and the opportunities we have in our sectors, right? And with levels being a pioneer and taking a whole life cycle approach, I think it's just a big step forward. Thank you as well for linking it or referring to the Green Deal and Bauhaus. We got a question from Andre Bittner, which I would already like to ask you now. Andre asks, why do we need the EU levels when we have got the new EU taxonomy and delegated act? Hasn't it become obsolete by now? So maybe you could give a brief answer to that and share what the potential link is with the EU taxonomy.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the taxonomy is, first of all, for those, I mean, that is to identify sustainable finance, right, to steer investment. And I would assume that there will still be quite a lot of projects which may not, which may be, how can I say, buildings will be built even though they are not really targeted by big investors wanting to use the taxonomy to have their investments identified as sustainable finance or sustainable investments. So it is rather so that here with levels we want to tackle the full market, we want to provide something which gets almost anyone interested in doing a bit better, interested in getting these first ideas of what life cycle and circularity is in this regard and how it impacts the building project, what can be done. So it is rather so that is the basis, that is the spine or the common language, which we can then use to, can I say, support bringing in these kinds of concepts into different kinds of policy initiatives. And one of them is indeed sustainable finance, where we have made use so far of two of the indicators, because the first sustainable finance work, the Delegated Act, is focusing on climate. So there we have used the indicators which are linked to greenhouse gas emissions. But as you probably also know, there is now continuing work on sustainable finance for other kinds of taxonomy criteria linked to other kinds of aspects. And again, indeed, levels will play an important role there as well to steer those. But as I also said, we have the revisions of the Energy Performance of Building Directive, the EED, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and others coming up. And with the help of levels, we can then make sure that we can get those kinds of concepts into policy. Levels itself is not the policy. Levels is the common language to get these things into policy.
Thank you. Very well explained. Thank you, Josefina. Then I'm gonna move on to Yvette. So Yvette, can you please share with us your experience on the do's and don'ts for companies to embed circularity in their daily operations?
Yes, thank you so much. I will try. So hello, everyone. Very nice to be here and to speak for this international delegation. My name is Yvette Watson, and I'm co-founder of Five Factory. And my expertise lays more in the existing built environment and the exploitation of buildings. And this is maybe also where our biggest challenge is, because 99% of all the built environment is already built, and only 1% is going to be built new. And of course, that's going to be sustainable. I have no doubt about that, and more circular every day. But it's about what are we going to do with our existing buildings. So next slide, please. I will tell you very short about my company. Five Factory is a passionate consultancy company, and with great enthusiasm, we help other organizations to translate their sustainable and circular ambitions, high over mostly, into really practical projects and solutions, and creating circular coalitions in the supply chain. So that's what we do with our consultancy company. Then we have a calculation department, because well, we need to do more than only have like really nice projects. We also need to know what the real impact is that we made. And I think this is also why Level is a really good tool, because it really calculates and measures on what the status quo is and how you're going to move forward, and what certain how you say that, improvements will be worth in the impact sphere on the life cycle analysis. So that's really cool. And then our third part is that we inspire and activate all employees within an organization through great gamified e-learning with the PI Accelerator to create like real mass on action. And if everyone, with every intellect on board, in a transition towards a circular economy, I think we'll go much, much faster. So that's a short introduction. Next slide, please. So what is the horizon? I think I'm also a chair of a Delta plan of sustainable renovation for the Dutch Green Building Council. And I think it's important that we tackle our building stock in an integral way. So if we make these buildings more sustainable, it's a real missed opportunity if we first make them only energy neutral, and then we think about the environmental impacts of the materials or the social impact that we could have made. So these themes such as climate adaptation and nature inclusiveness, or circularity, health and well-being, also social goals like inclusivity or social cohesion, or the connection between people is just as important for a future-proof built environment. So this is also why I think Levels framework, I haven't worked with it yet, but I've looked through it before this presentation. I think it really comes in handy because it doesn't solely focus on energy or only at circularity, but it focuses on more goals than that and make it compatible with each other, so you know the right way forward. Next slide, please. So this is always a slide that I show within the building sector, because I think we often approach it more in a process way, and then we start with the design, and then we execute the design, and then we run into some maintenance, and then we hope, of course, that it contributes a bit to this doing a really good business operations, and we really have no idea whether it contributes to social impact. So you see that the costs and also the positive impacts are made actually on the end of this chain, on the operations and the social values. But we always start with the design, and that's where the least costs are and the least value is. So this is why we always try to turn it around and start with what should it give us, and then we explore back into and make the design so that it serves the end game. So next slide, please. So it's really important to also focus within when you do a renovation or build a building, to focus on the user space, I think, because that's going to be more than 30 years. So what does it cost, like in total cost of ownership from an integrated approach, but also what does it cost the environment, the energy, but also the life cycle analysis, and what does it deliver, like health and well-being and productivity, social connections. And how do you stay flexible in time? So you don't only build it for the coming 30 years, but what after that? And what do the materials do? But also, what is the function of the social community going to be? So you can participate on these changes. Next slide, please. So when we put in a request for proposal in the market on like a renovation of a building, we always approach it in a combination of just the amount of claiming on what you do know, but also giving space for innovation and creativity on what you don't really know. So for instance, there are a lot of great KPIs you can use to put these claims into order, or like you also see here, like we use BREEAM, or we use the GPR method on the circular prestige of buildings, or the building circularity index, but also levels could be a really good baseline for a claim for what you really want to achieve as lowest bar. And then you can put out challenges into the market which exceed expectations on these claims, and you give really room for innovations and creativity from the market. So if the request of proposal is more like a growing model instead of like a technical plan of action, then you give much more room to grow into a much more sustainable renovation or building than when you set it all in stones. Next slide, please. So you have the request of proposal for a renovation or that sort of kind, but you also have just existing supply chain. And what we also do a lot in the Netherlands is we build circular collaborations, circular coalitions, we call them. Because it's very important that you acknowledge that the impact you're able to make in the collaborating with your suppliers and clients towards a more sustainable future. So in the Netherlands, we support several circular coalitions to handle complex goals such as zero waste office or circular operations or a circular building, energy neutral housing. It has to do with more supply chains. And we put them all together, and they commit to the same big goals, and they collaborate to achieve the goals. And a lot of knowledge is shared, and sometimes it's also quite scary because there's some competitors in the same group, but there's also a lot of learning and enthusiasm to go forward and to innovate together. Next slide, please. So the realization that the use of raw materials entails an environmental burden that is just as great or even greater than the direct emissions and energy of buildings. It's really important that we move forward to data-based decision making. And we need to know if the energy reduction measures are not only heavy environmental impacts related to the and also related to the total cost of ownership. So you can really make data-driven decisions and not based on a gut feeling, right? But on real impact. So we have a colleague, Mira Conchi, and she made this model where she measures all of the reducing energy measures in a building to make a building energy neutral. She can put it in a measurement to measure, okay, what's the energy reduction it does, but also how much material and what is the life cycle analysis of it, and then what are the costs of it. And then you can easily see which steps to make first and how to make these decisions. And I think this is also what Level wants to approach to make more data-driven decisions. And so the framework, I think offers a really transparent and harmonized reporting platform, and also across the whole life cycle. And I think that's a real improvement. Well, the question mainstream. Well, worldwide, the Circularity Gap Report states that we reuse 8.6 of our materials and minerals, and in the Netherlands, that's even 24.5%. So I think we're making a lot of great steps, but we need to go faster, of course. But I think there are a lot of great examples growing. And then I had a last slide, but I think I'm over my time now. So maybe you can see that back. I put different aspects down on where circularity meets the exploitation phase of a building and where you can integrate the principles. So thank you very much. I think if anyone has a question, I would be really happy to answer that.
Okay, thank you, Yvette. We did have one question, indeed, from Andre as well. It says, you spoke about KPIs. What are some KPIs from your standpoint that have been valuable and solid for orientation? Is there a common ground between KPIs for new buildings and existing ones?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is a common ground because it's about environmental impacts. So you could yes, sorry, did you want to say something? No. Oh yeah. So it's about environmental impact, and that's you can calculate that with carbon emissions. It's also about the amount of material and about the amount of raw material and about the amount of bio-based material, and to reduce the usage of that. It's about life cycle, so it's about how long can we use it for, the during. So I think there are a lot of KPIs that are a common ground for new buildings and existing buildings. The only thing is that with existing buildings, you need to work with what's there rather than tear the building down and build a new building, because now we see that it's far more important also to think of the material flows than only think of energy usage. Is that an answer? Or is that a...
To me, it was an answer. If Andre has a different opinion, he can always, of course, ask a follow-up question, and maybe we can still get into that after everybody's intervention. So thank you, Yvette.
Yes, welcome.
I will now move on to Tina. Tina, we've now heard from the first two speakers what's happening both at a policy level and a company level. So I would like to take it to the material level. So can you share with us your views on the role both of recycling and reusing materials and the role that they have in moving towards a circular economy?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I think it's great, and it's great to be coming right after Josefina and Yvette, because there are some similarities and then there's some differences. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the similarities. I think Josefina was talking about, CO2 emissions and waste, and some of these numbers are very similar to what, and we would hope so, what Josefina had. But at the same time, the measurement of CO2 is something that's still quite young, and there are a lot of different ways of measuring life cycle CO2. So I think what's interesting is to say that this is a field where we know the built environment has outsized impact on our well-being and on the planet. But when it comes to precise measurement, there are a number of different ways of measuring, and there are different numbers out there. But I think one thing that we all are aware of is that the CO2 emissions of the construction and building industry globally is around 40% of CO2 emissions. But what we probably haven't really completely gathered, and I think there was a bit of this also in the second presentation by Yvette, is how much of those emissions are actually in the embedded portion. And we know that globally, 11% of our emissions, global carbon emissions for this industry, are due to materials that are employed. But if you look at, for instance, the RICS did a whole life carbon assessment in 2017, and it actually turns out that if you look at the whole life carbon cycle of a building, 65 to 70% of the carbon emissions are linked to either the extraction, the production, the construction of those materials on site, their repair, their replacement, and ultimately their demolition and disposal. So while we're saying our sector impacts 40% of global carbon emissions, well, 65 to 70%, depending if it's an office or if it's a warehouse, are due to actually the built part of the equation rather than the operational carbon. So I think that's really important. Then we get to a similar number that Josefina was looking at, which is waste production. Overall in the EU, construction and demolition waste is about 38%, so a little over a third. We also have 40% of global resource consumption, 50% of extracted materials. And the thing about the waste production that's really important is that in waste production, there are, depending on the country of origin, there's 10 to 30% of materials that are brought to site which are never used and disposed of as waste. It's a huge amount. These are virgin materials. So again, extracting materials, producing them, delivering them to site, and then actually treating them as a waste stream. The supply chain in the construction industry has been notoriously fragmented and wasteful. Not of their own willingness, but this has been a long uphill battle for the construction industry that's been challenged with, project delays, cost overages, but also wasted materials that are often caused by disconnected processes and a lack of being able to coordinate. There's very little digitalization, which is coming now, but it's been a long time coming. So if we could pass to the next slide. I think one thing we need to really look closely at is, okay, circularity is certainly the key, but should we be talking about material reuse or recycling? And if you look here, I'm looking at a waste framework, which is not specific to the building sector, but more general. And you will see that reuse is very, very high up on the pecking order. Going from bottom to top here, we have the value growth, the value retention. So at the bottom of the scale, R9 or the disposal, we have the least value preservation. But when we go up to the top and right before the top level, we have preparing for reuse. Reuse is one of the ways that we can save the most energy, the most CO2 emissions, and also we can preserve value. Let me give you an example. So it's not too, I would say, theoretical. Let's look at structural steel. Reclaiming used structural steel as opposed to the common practice of recycling steel by remelting scrap offers significant environmental benefits and potential cost savings. Keep in mind that 1.9 tons of CO2 are emitted for every ton of steel that is produced. That's around 8% of the global CO2 emissions are in steel production. So it's a huge lever. And steel is an obvious candidate for reclamation and reuse, as opposed to remelting. The long-term average price of structural steel scrap sections in the UK and structural steel, scrap sections versus buying structural steel ready for employment is over 300 Great British pounds per ton. So even if you take into cost, extra costs for deconstruction, testing, storage, refabrication, you're still looking at cost savings, which is quite important, and you're saving 1.9 tons of CO2. If we could take a look at the next slide. So, you know, after everything that I've just said, it seems like a no-brainer that we should be reusing our building materials. But in the construction sector, less than 1% of building materials are actually reused in their current or close to current form. So why aren't we doing more of this reuse in the construction industry? There are strong systemic barriers, which means that the supply and demand of secondhand construction materials just hasn't yet taken off. Some of the main ones that come to mind are the traditional mode of demolition versus deconstruction. Now, why do we prefer today, in today's work sites, to demolish rather than deconstruct? It has come about over time because of urban land, which is very valuable and very scarce, and therefore there's a lot of pressure to get the old product out, the new product in very quickly. There's also a fact of cost and skill sets of labor required to demount versus demolish. And then there's the high mechanization of demolition. So using big machines, it's a lot quicker, etc. And it's been relatively inexpensive to send a lot of that debris off to landfill because the environmental costs have not been factored in at present. So one of the other barriers that I see is the quality assurance side. A lot of the expectations today of quality assurance, of manufacturers' warranties, have led to the non-acceptability of used products that are unknown or unquantified technical capacity. So this needs to change, and we need to have more reuse and recertification guarantees. And finally, the lengthy lead times between design, specification, procurement of buildings, and their construction can seemingly be incompatible with the need for on-site deconstructed materials to be rapidly evacuated. So these are the barriers that I see. Can we move on to the next slide? So why am I very optimistic, actually, that the circular economy will grow and the reuse of building materials will grow? It's because we have a certain number of levers that are being activated at present. One of them is the ESG targets and regulations. Josefina talked quite a bit about the EU taxonomy, the renovation wave, the energy performance building directive, the embedded carbon and whole life cycle carbon targets and roadmaps. And this is an opportunity for me to say that obviously and notably public procurement could be and should be leading the way here. And the private sector will also be joining, I think, thanks to the EU green taxonomy and some of the elements in it that require recycling and reuse of materials. But this is also an opportunity for me to do a plug for the work I'm doing as RICS Europe Ambassador to the World Green Building Council Building Life campaign, where we are currently preparing a whole life cycle carbon roadmaps for 10 European countries, and we will be providing them as well as a European level roadmap to the EU Commission in view of their own development of a whole life cycle carbon roadmap for the built environment. The other lever that I think is really helpful and coming of age are technology and standards. We've got more and more ways of measuring. We've got carbon accounting, which is coming to fruition, RFID tagging, electronic material passports, all very new, but progressing, blockchain tracing of materials. All these things are going to allow us to really qualify and measure the materials within a building in order for them to be qualified, quantified, recorded, and valued as such. So this is really an important change. And alongside this, I think carbon metrics of building materials will also start to have their own value as carbon credits and the cost of carbon emissions go mainstream. And finally, last but not least, and this is where I think I see things a bit differently than Yvette does, is I believe that designers, in the large sense of the word, architects, engineers, the different players in the design field are key to making this change. Keep in mind that 80%, an estimated 80% of a product's environmental impact is determined at design stage. Now I'll just take a second to let that sink in. 80% is designed in the environmental impact. So I think this relatively new and growing movement to create a design manifesto around reused building materials needs to be levered and supported. And what I'm thinking of here are the new European Bauhaus, the buildings as material banks movement, cradle to cradle design. These are all really, really key in order to get buildings to be designed to become more circular and in order to create the value of the materials within the building. And I think that's my last slide. Sorry. Facing the climate crisis, that's my conclusion. Our construction and building industry has an outsized impact on climate change, on the dwindling stock of finite resources, on waste production we've seen, but also something I didn't mention, local employment opportunities. The circular economy is very, very local and would create opportunities for upskilling to demount buildings, to recertify, to guarantee those materials. There's a host of local employment opportunities here. And for me, the time to act is now. The circular economy is the only possible route to meaningful change. Anything we build, and this Yvette and I agree on, anything we build will cost embodied carbon. So, everything we refurbish will cost embodied carbon, but to a lesser extent than building new. So what we need to do when we're building new and when we're refurbishing is reuse the materials that we find within existing buildings. This is, for me, the only solution.
Thank you, Tina. The circular economy is the only possible road to meaningful change. I like that sentence. It shows, and also through your presentation and the other two, that a lot has changed already. but that we still have a way to go. But through upskilling, through the digital advancements, etc., we may very well get there. I liked how you mentioned about the barriers that not all costs are factored in, such as landfill, which to me is symptomatic for the linear economy, as I described it. So we need to internalize the external cost, again, to put it in economic terms. And you also mentioned the many ways of measuring, for example, CO2, and that we may not agree on the exact figures, but that the built environment, to put it in your words, has an outsized impact, both on people's lives and the built environment itself. So which to me, again, you basically linked it to the donut economy of the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. So thank you for all of that. I will now move on to the final speaker, Kevin. Tina showed us the pyramid about where material reuse sits compared to recycling and a few other steps. Maybe you can follow up on that and share what you've been working on and how that can help with reusing of materials.
Many thanks, Sander. And it's always hard going last, and it's a hard act to follow those three very good presentations. But on my first slide, this shows a bit of background about the project we work on, which is the Transpennine Route Upgrade Project, which is a multi-billion-pound transformative railway infrastructure programme that will improve connectivity across the north of England. And we are very privileged to be working on this pilot with such a forward-thinking client and with the environment at the heart of their design. And this asset, when it is complete, this rail asset, when it's complete, will be handed over to Network Rail. And as part of this pilot, we'll be looking at the Transpennine Route Upgrade and the Network Rail environmental sustainability strategy. And they have their own circular economy roadmap, which we'll be looking at that, trying to help them with that journey. We'll be looking at the British Standards 8001. As Tina said there, the 9 R's are very perfectly articulated. And we'll be looking at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Circular Economy Procurement Framework. And on the left there, you can see the Ellen MacArthur butterfly diagram. And the idea of the Ellen MacArthur butter diagram is to sort of design out waste and design out pollution, keep the products and materials and assets in use for as long as possible, and regenerate the natural system. So we'll be looking at those inner blue circles as we work through the pilot, and we have many great partners working with us. We have the RICS, they're helping us with the design and data integrity, working with Andrew Knight. We're working with Fabri, which is the Foundation for International Blockchain and Real Estate Expertise, and they'll be helping us with blockchain and the distributed ledger technology, the DLTs, looking at tracking assets throughout the pilot. We've also got fantastic support from Cardiff University, from an academia and an academic research platform, Tata Steel from a supply chain perspective, and Ellen MacArthur helping and looking at that we're using that procurement framework. And Arup are actually a global knowledge partner of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So what I've not shown on this first slide is that, and what I'd like to share is the UK Government Construction Innovation Hub, the Construction Leadership Council, have a new procurement tool that's coming out called the Value Toolkit, which has been pulled together with over 200 experts across government and industry. And I was glad to be part of that journey. So on my next slide, this shows the overarching aims of it. So TRU and Arup are very delighted to be on the first wave of early adopters, and we will be trialling this tool throughout this pilot. The tool itself was only launched on the 26th of April, and there are 4 predominant capitals within the toolkit. It looks at the produce capitals, and within the produce capital, we look at elements such as life cycle costing, very much like the levels framework that we heard on the previous presentations. The production, the actual delivery of the quality asset, the resilience of that asset, and obviously most important to the sort of EMF and to the ESG providers, making sure there is a profitable return. We also look at the natural capital, and the natural capital looks at biodiversity, climate, air, water, land, resource use. And then we look at the social capital. The social capital looks at equality, diversity, influence, consultation, networks and connections. And then the human capital. Human capital looks at employment, skills, knowledge, health, and experience. And the idea is to drive a better social and economic outcomes. We're also looking at this tool is not meant to replace existing tools that you're having, but more to sort of complement them and to help the current existing processes and guidance. And on my next slide, it looks through the life process of the asset, very much like a REBA stage or the GRIP stages or the PACE stages of a project. You'll start with the early engagement, which is most important, and there will be 5 streams and 5 phases as you work through this tool. The need stage, once you've actually got the requirements captured. The optioneering stage, which is very important, is where value is driven out. And in the design stage, as Tina was saying, this is where 80% of the work is designed in. So we look at where this is able to design out that waste at that stage. And obviously that would shape how we go on to define and how we look to contract out risk and do risk share. But the tool doesn't stop at design, it goes on to the delivery phase where it will be used as a reference document to track and make sure you're still on track and make sure the solution meets the current need. And the blue line at the bottom is very important as well, is to make sure we have a feedback loop and that data is retained and we keep on learning from that data. And on my next slide, this slide just shows you an example of what the web toolkit would look like coming at UK projects. It's first been trialled through the education section first, but will be trialled across all procurement from the UK government. It's not there to give a definitive answer, but just to present the project with data such that they can make an informed decision. And on the next slide, this shows the actual project itself in sort of summary, where we start at the early stage, as early as possible, using the Ellen McCarthy and the value toolkit, started working up that design at early stage. And we're going to concentrate on a steel cladded panel. And the reason why we picked a steel cladded panel is because obviously this will touch to the actual Hackett report and the golden thread of information. So Tata Steel are working with us to try and bring back some of that supply chain information. Where did the material come from? Is it local? What's the impact on social and human capitals? We then transfer that information into a digital specification. We would add into that digital specification disaggregation information, almost like a reverse IKEA manual, so that can be locked for posterity. We also put into the digital specification service record intervals, like a car logbook. During the BIM stages, we'd actually use as much information we've got, like currently there's a Excel in BIM, so we can actually bring BIM information into Excel so that all parties on the project can actually share that same information. Then we'd move on to the actual in-use stage, where that information, that same information, the ICMS data that the RICS have helped us work on, and that data structure can be used right the way through to the FM stage. And the digital spec will record the actual service records and have that golden thread of information. Using that digital technology for data sharing and using that BIM information. This then looks at digital twin and for easy use of data. The value toolkit continues to be used throughout this stage and that information recorded on a digital passport. Then when you get to the final stage, in the recovery stage, because you've had the information locked into it from the early stage about how to recover the information, we have a better chance of actually recovering as much information as possible and reusing that on future projects. We'd also get design information to make sure that the actual information was credible and that what we set out as a design intent was actually achieved on the project. And having Cardiff University, it's great to get that independent sort of external view on the project. And the fact that we've tracked the data on this steel project, we can look at different ways of maybe leasing steel. Very much like Philips lease lighting at Schiphol Airport and other examples. The steel itself now could be of an investment, an ESG investment, again, perfectly presented during Tina's presentation, where steel can actually be looked as an asset that can go on after its design life and its in-use life. So on my next slide, this just shows bringing it all together. The passport of information will be at the center of an asset, very much like you have a logbook on your car. The logbook for an asset will actually hold all the information such that we can increase the value of an asset right the way through to the end. We see on the left there, this is the design stage where data is born, and we transfer the design specification into a digital format so that every change in that specification is recorded in a blockchain for immutable records. During the construction stage, we capture all the value engineering, and in the use stage, the actual FM contractor will have access to the design intent, so he can make sure he looks after that asset as best as possible. And then finally, at the reuse stage, the data's already there, so they know how to break down that cladded panel down to its constituent parts to get the most of the materials back into use. And then on my final slide, this just shows that there's an awful lot of information and material out there. We would encourage people to get involved in the communities, and to read the literature and to get involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That's really a great pilot project showing how through a digital passport and using blockchain, you can make measurement and reporting transparent and concrete, which no doubt will help inform decision making both by companies but also policy making by governments, and will definitely help transferring from the linear economy to the circular economy. So thank you as well. Given time, I will just provide a very short summary before finalizing this webinar. I think looking at the question of the webinar, is circularity now mainstream in public procurement or anywhere else? I think the answer is no, not yet. I think it would have been a good discussion as well, maybe for a follow-up webinar, but I think that the linear economy is still more mainstream. But circularity is up and coming, and if you ask me, the inevitable way forward. We've heard how EU policy is focused on this, how companies are being prepared by advisors such as Yvette, how we get a better understanding of materials, how we need to move not only from more recycling but also to more reusing, acknowledging that 80% of CO2 is already embedded in the design stage. And with Kevin finally showing at the end, showing us a great pilot project on how this is all made transparent and measured with the help of digital tools. So thank you all for your interventions. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did as well. So moving on, that brings us nearly to the end of the webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. If you can move to the next slide, please. Then just a bit of advertisement. As we're slowly, hopefully getting out of the COVID period, as we all get vaccinated, we are, like many, also planning our live events. Some of you may know that we have a yearly, or we used to have a yearly gathering of the World Built Environment Forum, with the next one is scheduled on the 25th and the 24th and 25th of January in Dubai. So mark that in your calendars and watch this space, as we will be talking there about a livable city. You can also follow us, as I said, on our website, register on our website. We also have a great app you can download both on your Apple phone or on your Android phone, where you can re-listen to this webinar, other webinars, read the articles, and also, very importantly, join the debate yourself. So with that, I thank you all for joining the webinar. Please answer our short survey, and I look forward to having you with us on our next either European regional webinar or one of the many other webinars that my colleagues are organizing. Thank you very much.